All right, so we're diving deep today into 1 John 4:18, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that verse again.
Hmm.
But we're not going for the typical Sunday school lesson here. You already know what the verse says. What you're looking for are unique perspectives, maybe some sermon illustrations, something that'll really get people thinking.
That's exactly what we're going for. We've got this collection of sermons on 1 John 4:18, and it's fascinating to see how these different pastors approach it. I mean, we're talking about seasoned preachers, and they found ways to bring out nuances that you might not have even considered before.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Well, right away, several of the sermons focused on that core message, perfect love casts out fear. But what was really interesting was how they went beyond just stating that. They really dug into how, for example, one pastor used this analogy of fear being like a tormenting spirit.
Ooh, a tormenting spirit. That really captures the feeling of fear, doesn't it? Like it's always there, whispering doubts and anxieties.
Exactly. And this pastor went on to explain that the Greek word for perfect in that verse, teleos, it actually implies a process. It's a process of becoming perfected in love.
So it's not like fear just disappears instantly.
Yeah, it's not like a light switch.
It's more gradual.
Yeah, as our understanding and experience of God's love grows, that fear starts to lose its grip.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect, fearless state overnight. It's more about an ongoing journey, growing in love, letting that love slowly chip away at our fears.
Exactly. And that's a message that could really resonate with a lot of people. I mean, we all struggle with fear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes it feels overwhelming.
Right.
But this idea that we're being perfected in love, it offers a sense of hope. It reminds us that we're not alone in this and that God's love is constantly at work in us to overcome those fears.
Absolutely. It's a constant reassurance that we're not stuck with those fears forever.
Okay, so that's one pastor's take on how perfect love casts out fear. Did any of the other sermons offer a different angle?
Yeah, there were a few other intriguing approaches. Another pastor connected fear to punishment.
Okay.
Their point was that if we truly grasp how deep God's love for us is, that unconditional, unwavering acceptance, then the fear of retribution just melts away.
That makes sense, because if we know we're loved and forgiven no matter what, we don't need to live in constant fear of punishment. We can approach God with confidence and trust.
Exactly. It's a reminder that God's love isn't conditional on our performance or behavior.
Right.
This perspective could be really powerful for people who tend to focus on God's justice. They might need that extra reassurance of his mercy.
Yeah, I can already see how that could be a powerful message for a sermon. It's not about earning God's love. It's about resting in the knowledge that we already have it.
Right. And then there was another pastor who took a slightly different approach. They linked fear to a lack of intimacy with God.
And they use this really interesting analogy, a teepee.
A teepee. How does a teepee relate to fear and intimacy with God?
Well, the pastor explained that just like a teepee provides structure and protection from the elements, a deep, intimate relationship with God offers us safety and security.
Okay.
And when we feel safe and secure in God's love, fear naturally recedes.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. It's not just about knowing about God or even just believing in him. It's about cultivating that close personal relationship where we feel truly known and loved by him.
It's like finding that safe haven where we can let our guard down, be completely ourselves, knowing that we're accepted and cherished just as we are.
And from that place of security, fear loses its power to control us. You know, that teepee analogy could really resonate with people. It's so visually evocative. It makes this abstract concept of intimacy with God feel more tangible and relatable.
It's one of those illustrations that sticks with you, and it could spark some really meaningful conversations in a Bible study group, or even with individuals who are struggling with fear. It opens the door to exploring what it truly means to have that deep, abiding connection with God, and how that connection can be a source of strength and comfort in times of anxiety.
Okay, so we've got three distinct perspectives here on how perfect love casts out fear. We've got the process of being perfected in love, the assurance of God's unwavering love, which eliminates that fear of punishment, and the safety and security found in that intimacy with God. Each one offers a slightly different nuance, and they're all thought-provoking in their own way.
And that's what's so great about looking at these sermons. It's like getting a glimpse into different minds wrestling with the same profound truth. It challenges us to go beyond our usual interpretations, consider new possibilities.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on to the next theme, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Which of these interpretations of casting out fear resonated most with you? Which one do you think could be particularly impactful for pastors and Bible study leaders?
That's a great question. I think each of these interpretations offers valuable insights and could be used effectively in a teaching context. But the one that really stood out to me was the idea of being perfected in love.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about why that one resonated with you.
Well, I think it speaks to the reality of our human experience. We're not perfect beings. We're going to struggle with fear.
Right?
But this interpretation offers hope and encouragement. It reminds us that God's love is constantly at work in us, refining us, helping us to grow in love. And as we grow in love, fear naturally begins to lose its grip.
That's a really powerful message, especially in a world that feels so full of fear and anxiety. It's a reminder that we don't have to strive for some kind of unattainable perfection. We simply keep our eyes fixed on God's love and allow it to transform us from the inside out.
Exactly. It's about embracing the journey, knowing that God is with us every step of the way, gently guiding us towards wholeness and healing.
I can see how that perspective could be incredibly comforting and encouraging for people,
Mhm.
especially those feeling overwhelmed by fear. It's a reminder that we're not alone in our struggles and that God's love is always there to support and sustain us.
And it also challenges us to be patient with ourselves and with others. We're all at different points in our journey of being perfected in love,
Yeah.
and it's important to extend grace and understanding along the way.
It's not about judgment or condemnation. It's about encouragement and support. And I think that's a message that our world desperately needs to hear.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another theme that emerged from these sermons, the idea of love as action.
Ooh, love is action.
That sounds intriguing.
It is, because we often think of love as a warm, fuzzy feeling, right?
Yeah.
But one pastor really challenged that notion, highlighting that love is a verb. It's something we do, not just something we feel.
Okay. I'm starting to see where this is going. It's not enough to just talk about love or have good intentions. We have to actually put love into action. Exactly. And this pastor emphasized that true love involves understanding empathy and sacrifice. To illustrate this point, they shared a really powerful example, the story of Sister Helen Prejean.
Ah, Sister Helen. Now, for those who might not be familiar with her work, she's a Catholic nun known for her tireless advocacy for death row inmates.
Yes, and this pastor talked about how Sister Helen embodies love in action. She chooses to see the humanity in those who are often dehumanized and marginalized by society. She offers compassion, support, and ultimately helps many of them find peace in the face of death.
It's such a powerful example of what it means to love unconditionally, even in the most challenging circumstances.
Mhm.
It's not about condoning their actions. It's about recognizing their inherent worth as human beings and offering them dignity and respect.
And it's a reminder that love isn't always easy or comfortable. Sometimes it means stepping outside of our comfort zones, challenging our own biases, and reaching out to those who are different from us.
It's about putting our faith into action and making a tangible difference in the lives of others.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this powerful example of love in action from Sister Helen's story. Did any other pastors use real-world illustrations to bring this concept to life?
You know they did. One pastor talked about the work of Doctors Without Borders, those incredible individuals who risked their lives to provide medical care in war zones and disaster areas.
Wow, that's a truly selfless act of love. They're putting their own safety aside to serve those in desperate need.
Exactly. And it's a powerful reminder that love knows no boundaries. It transcends cultural differences, political ideologies, and even physical danger. It's about responding to the needs of others with compassion and a willingness to make sacrifices.
I'm starting to see a theme here. It's not about grand gestures or heroic acts. It's about those everyday choices to put love into practice in whatever ways we can.
And you know, sometimes those seemingly small acts of kindness can have the biggest impact on people's lives. A listening ear, a helping hand, a word of encouragement. These can all be powerful expressions of love that make a real difference.
It's about being intentional with our actions and looking for opportunities to show love to those around us.
Exactly. And this pastor challenged their congregation to consider, how can we move beyond sentimental notions of love to practical expressions of it? How can we be the hands and feet of Christ in our daily lives?
It's about bridging the gap between words and actions, between belief and behavior. It's about living out our faith in tangible ways that make a positive impact on the world.
And that, I think, is a message that resonates deeply with 1 John 4:18. The verse isn't just about feeling love. It's about letting that love flow out of us and into the world.
So how can our listeners, especially pastors and Bible study leaders, encourage their congregations to make that shift from passive sentimentality to active love? Are there any specific strategies or techniques that came up in these sermons?
There were a few really interesting ideas. One pastor talked about the importance of creating opportunities for people to practice love in tangible ways. They suggested organizing service projects, volunteer opportunities, or even just encouraging small acts of kindness within the community.
That makes sense. It's about providing practical outlets for people to put their faith into action.
Exactly. And another pastor talked about the importance of storytelling. They emphasized how sharing stories of people who are living out love in inspiring ways can motivate others to do the same.
It's like when we see love in action, it becomes more real, more tangible, and we're more likely to be inspired to follow their example. And I bet those stories stick with people much longer than abstract concepts or theological arguments.
Absolutely. And you don't have to look far to find those stories. They're all around us. From the volunteer at the local soup kitchen to the single mom working two jobs to provide for her kids, every act of love, big or small, is a testament to the power of God's love working in the world.
That's a really inspiring thought. Okay, so we've talked about how perfect love casts out fear and how love is an action. There was one more theme that stood out to me in the outline: the connection between guilt and fear. Did any of the pastors address that?
They did. And it's a fascinating perspective that might not be immediately obvious when you think about 1 John 4:18. One pastor in particular really delved into this connection, suggesting that a lot of our anxieties actually stem from unaddressed guilt.
Unaddressed guilt. That's an interesting angle. How did they explain that connection?
Well, they talked about how guilt can create this constant sense of unease, like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop, we feel like we've messed up, and we're constantly bracing ourselves for the consequences.
It's like that feeling of walking on eggshells, afraid to make another mistake.
Exactly. And the pastor went on to explain that this fear of punishment can be paralyzing. It can keep us from taking risks, pursuing our dreams, or even just enjoying life to the fullest.
Because we're so focused on avoiding potential pain or retribution that we miss out on the joy and freedom that comes from living in the present moment.
That's a great way to put it. And to illustrate this point, the pastor used some really relatable analogies. They talked about guilt trips. You know those situations where someone makes us feel bad for something we've done or haven't done?
Oh yeah, I think we've all experienced those at some point. They can be so manipulative and leave us feeling emotionally drained.
Exactly. And the pastor pointed out how those guilt trips can trigger a fear response in us. We start to associate certain actions or behaviors with negative consequences, and we become afraid to step out of line.
It's like a learned response, where we try to avoid anything that might trigger those feelings of guilt or shame.
Precisely. And they also compared the lingering effects of guilt to those jump scares in horror movies.
Oh, I get it. It's like you think you're safe, you moved on from the scary part, and then bam, something triggers that fear response again. You're constantly on edge, waiting for the next scare.
Exactly. And the pastor's point was that unaddressed guilt can have that same lingering effect. It can keep us trapped in a cycle of fear and anxiety, even when the original situation has long passed.
So it's not enough to just acknowledge the guilt. We have to actually address it and work through it in order to break free from that cycle of fear.
Right. And that's where the message of 1 John 4:18 comes in. Perfect love casts out fear. But in order to fully experience that love, we have to deal with the guilt that's blocking it.
It's like we need to clear the path for God's love to flow freely into our lives.
Exactly. And that's why this pastor's approach was so interesting. They weren't just talking about how to overcome fear. They were talking about how to address the underlying guilt that often gives fear its power.
So it's about going deeper, getting to the root of the problem, and dealing with it head on.
It's about recognizing that true healing and freedom come from confronting our past mistakes, accepting God's forgiveness, and allowing His love to wash away those feelings of guilt and shame.
And that's a powerful message that could resonate with a lot of people who are struggling with anxiety or fear.
Absolutely. And this perspective could be incredibly helpful for pastors and Bible study leaders who are working with individuals who are dealing with these issues. It provides a framework for understanding the complex interplay between guilt and fear, and offers hope for healing and transformation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about how perfect love casts out fear, how love is an action, and how unaddressed guilt can fuel our fears. What I'm finding really fascinating is that each of these themes, while seemingly distinct, ultimately points back to the transformative power of God's love.
That's a great observation. It's like we're seeing different facets of the same diamond, each one reflecting a different aspect of God's love and how it operates in our lives.
And that brings us to the last theme we wanted to explore in this deep dive: how some of these pastors used secular illustrations to bring their sermons to life.
Yes, this is a topic I'm particularly passionate about. I love how creative these pastors got with their illustrations.
Me too. Remember that teepee analogy we talked about earlier?
Of course. That one was so vivid and memorable, it really helped to make that abstract concept of intimacy with God more tangible and understandable.
And it was such a perfect example of using a secular illustration to eliminate a spiritual truth.
Exactly. And another pastor used a really interesting analogy to illustrate the choice between living in sin or living in righteousness. They talked about a yoke. You know, that wooden frame that's used to harness two oxen together.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So how does a yoke relate to sin and righteousness?
Well, the pastor explained that sin is like a heavy yoke that weighs us down and keeps us from moving forward freely. But righteousness, which is found in Christ, is like a yoke that's easy and light. It allows us to walk in freedom and joy.
That's a powerful image. It really captures the contrast between the burden of sin and the liberating power of God's grace.
And to really drive the point home, this pastor actually brought an actual yoke to the sermon. They had someone from the congregation come up and try to lift it, and of course it was incredibly heavy and awkward to handle.
Wow, that's a bold move. I bet that really made an impact on the congregation.
It definitely did. It was a tangible, visceral experience that brought the message to life in a way that words alone couldn't. And then the pastor had the person try to lift a much smaller, lighter yoke, which represented the yoke of Christ.
Okay, so it was a visual demonstration of the contrast between the burden of sin and the lightness of Christ's yoke. That's brilliant.
It was. And you know what I love about this illustration is that it's so unexpected. It's not your typical Sunday school imagery.
It's fresh, it's creative, and it makes people think. And that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking for those aha moments, those unconventional perspectives that can spark new insights and deeper understanding.
So I'm sensing a challenge here for our listeners. Don't be afraid to think outside the box when it comes to sermon illustrations. Look for those unexpected connections between the secular world and spiritual truths.
And don't underestimate the power of tangible objects or experiences to bring those illustrations to life. Sometimes showing is more powerful than telling.
Okay, so we've covered three major themes from these sermons on 1 John 4:18. We've talked about how perfect love casts out fear, how love is an action, and how unaddressed guilt can fuel our fears.
And we've seen some really creative and effective sermon illustrations along the way. The teepee analogy for intimacy with God's sister Helen, Prejean's work with death row inmates, the guilt trip and horror movie comparisons. They all made complex ideas so much more relatable and memorable.
And we even had a pastor who brought an actual yoke to the sermon to illustrate the contrast between the burden of sin and the lightness of Christ's yoke.
Talk about thinking outside the box, and that's a key takeaway for our listeners. Think about how you can incorporate similar techniques in your own teaching. How can you make complex theological ideas more accessible and engaging for your audience?
It's about finding those creative ways to connect with people, to make the message come alive.
Precisely. And we have one more theme to explore in this deep dive. It might be the most surprising one yet. Are you ready for this?
Bring it on. Our listeners are ready to dive even deeper.
Okay, so remember how we talked about how some pastors connected fear to punishment and others linked it to a lack of intimacy with God?
Yes, those were some really insightful perspectives. What's the surprising theme you mentioned?
Well, one pastor tackled 1 John 4:18 from a totally different angle. They focused on the idea of choice.
Choice.
Yeah, specifically the choice between partnering with love or with fear.
Partnering with love or fear. That's intriguing. I haven't heard it framed that way before.
Right. Their point was that perfect love casts out fear. So if
Yeah.
we're experiencing fear, it suggests we haven't fully embraced or experienced perfect love yet.
Okay. I think I see where this is going. So instead of viewing fear as something that just happens to us, this pastor is suggesting it's a choice we make. Maybe not always consciously,
Yeah.
but a choice nonetheless.
Exactly. And they went on to explain that fear is often tied to the idea of punishment. You know, that feeling of if I mess up, something bad will happen to me. It's a mindset focused on consequences and retribution.
It's like we're always looking over our shoulder waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah.
And that can be exhausting, living with that constant sense of dread.
Absolutely. But the pastor contrasted this with the idea of partnering with love. Love, they argued, is all about grace and acceptance. It's about recognizing our own imperfections and extending that same grace to others.
So instead of being driven by fear of messing up, we're motivated by a desire to love and be loved. Imperfections and all. That's a powerful shift in perspective.
It really is. And you know what I found interesting? This pastor didn't shy away from the fact that choosing love isn't always easy. They acknowledge that sometimes it feels completely counterintuitive.
Especially when we've been conditioned to believe that fear is a necessary motivator. Like we need that fear to keep us in line, to make
Right.
us behave a certain way.
Precisely. But the pastor challenged that notion. They argued that while fear might provide a temporary sense of control, ultimately it leads to anxiety and isolation. Whereas choosing love, even when it's difficult, leads to freedom and connection.
It's like that saying, fear contracts, love expands.
Exactly. This pastor's message really struck a chord with me. It's a reminder that we always have a choice in how we respond to the world around us. We can let fear dictate our actions, or we can choose to lead with love even when it feels scary.
That's a powerful message. But it can also feel a bit daunting. For our listeners who are pastors and Bible study leaders, how can they practically apply this idea of choosing love over fear in their ministry? It seems like such a big concept. Where do you even start?
That's a great question. I think it starts with self-reflection. As leaders, we need to examine our own hearts and ask ourselves, where am I letting fear hold me back? Where am I choosing fear over love in my own life?
Because if we're not modeling that choice ourselves, it's going to be pretty difficult to encourage others to do the same.
Exactly. And then it's about creating a space where people feel safe to acknowledge their own struggles with fear and explore what it might look like to choose love instead.
So it's not just about preaching about love,
Yeah,
but actually cultivating an environment where love can flourish.
precisely. That might involve vulnerability, sharing our own stories of choosing love over fear even when it was hard. It might involve creating opportunities for people to practice love in tangible ways, through service forgiveness, or simply listening with compassion.
It's like we're planting seeds of love and then nurturing them so they can take root and grow.
I love that analogy. And remember, the fruit of that love isn't just individual transformation, it's a more connected and compassionate community.
You know, it's remarkable how all these different perspectives on 1 John 4:18 ultimately point back to the same core truth. Love is the antidote to fear.
Absolutely. Whether we're talking about being perfected in love, choosing love over fear, or witnessing the transformative power of love in action, it all boils down to embracing love as the guiding principle in our lives.
And that's a message that never loses its relevance or its power.
It really doesn't. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more nugget I want to share that connects back to our discussion about sermon illustrations.
Ooh, I'm always up for more creative illustration ideas. What did you find?
Well, one pastor took a really interesting approach to illustrating the idea of God's love being a source of strength and comfort. They used the analogy of a weighted blanket.
A weighted blanket. That's a new one. I'm curious to hear how they connected that to God's love.
Well, they talked about how weighted blankets are designed to provide a sense of calm and security. The gentle pressure simulates the feeling of being hugged or held, which can be incredibly soothing for people who are feeling anxious or overwhelmed.
Okay, I can see where they're going with this. It's like God's love is that comforting weight that envelops us and makes us feel safe and secure.
Exactly. And the pastor went on to explain that just like a weighted blanket can help to reduce stress and anxiety, God's love can provide us with a sense of peace and stability even in the midst of life's storms.
It's like that feeling of knowing that no matter what happens, we're held and protected by something bigger than ourselves.
Yes. And the pastor pointed out that this doesn't mean that life will always be easy or that we won't face challenges, but knowing that we have God's love as a constant source of strength and comfort can make all the difference in how we navigate those challenges.
It's like having that anchor that keeps us grounded even when the waves are crashing around us.
I love that imagery. And you know what's great about this illustration is that it's something that people can relate to on a visceral level.
It's tangible,
Mm,
it's familiar, and it evokes a very specific feeling that most people have experienced. It's not some abstract theological concept. It's
yeah,
something they can connect with on a personal level.
exactly. And that's what makes it such an effective illustration. It takes this profound truth about God's love and makes it accessible and relatable in a way that people can really grasp.
And it can spark some really interesting conversations about how people experience God's love in their own lives. Like, what are those things that bring them comfort and security? How does God's love manifest itself in their daily experiences?
It's about making those connections between the spiritual and the everyday, the profound and the practical.
And that's what good teaching is all about, isn't it? It's about finding those bridges that help people to connect with truth in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the final theme we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive. Are you ready to delve into the transformative power of God's love?
I'm definitely ready. This deep dive has already been so insightful, and I can't wait to hear what else these sermons have to offer. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 1 John 4:18. We've been exploring some really fascinating perspectives on this familiar verse. And it's like we've been given this backstage pass to see how experienced pastors approach this passage and find those fresh insights to share.
It's been inspiring to see how these pastors go beyond the surface level
Hmm.
and uncover those little hidden gems of wisdom, those things that really enrich our understanding of God's love and how it works in our lives.
Absolutely. We talked about how perfect love casts out fear, how love is an action, and how unaddressed guilt can fuel our fears. It's amazing how a seemingly straightforward verse, like 1 John 4:18, can have so much depth to it.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always more to discover, more to understand, and more to apply.
Speaking of applying these truths to our lives, the final theme we want to touch on is the transformative power of God's love. It came up in several of these sermons, and I'm curious to hear how these pastors addressed it.
Well, one pastor put it this way. They said, experiencing God's love should fundamentally change us. It shouldn't leave us the same. It should lead to a life that's marked by love for others.
So it's not just about having a warm, fuzzy feeling when we think about God's love. It's about that love overflowing into our actions and interactions with the world around us.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, they use a really beautiful analogy, a fragrance.
Okay.
They explain that just as a fragrance fills a room, God's love should permeate our lives, driving out fear and inspiring genuine love for others.
I love that imagery. It's so evocative. It's like you can almost smell that sweet aroma of love spreading outwards, touching everything it encounters.
And they went on to say that this outward expression of love, this is what distinguishes true disciples. It's the evidence of God's presence working in and through us.
It's like that saying, they'll know we are Christians by our love.
Exactly. And this pastor challenged their congregation to ask themselves, is my life a reflection of God's love? Am I known for my love, my compassion, my willingness to extend grace to others?
Those are powerful questions for all of us to consider, whether we're pastors, Bible study leaders, or simply followers of Christ. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how much we know about God's love. It's about how well we embody it in our daily lives.
Another pastor tackled this idea of transformation by highlighting the contrast between fear-based living and love-based living.
Okay, tell me more about that. How did they describe that contrast?
Well, they started by talking about how fear often leads to a scarcity mindset. We start to believe that there's not enough to go around, whether it's love resources or opportunities.
Okay.
And the scarcity mindset can lead to all sorts of negative behaviors, like hoarding jealousy and competition.
It's like we're constantly trying to protect what we have
Yeah,
because we're afraid of losing it.
exactly. But love, on the other hand, love leads to an abundance mindset.
Okay.
When we're rooted in God's love, we start to believe that there's enough for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
We're no longer driven by fear or scarcity, but by generosity and compassion.
It's like that feeling of being so full of love that it overflows into everything we do. We're not afraid to give freely because we know that we're connected to an inexhaustible source of love and abundance.
That's beautifully put. And this abundance mindset, it can be incredibly transformative. It can change the way we relate to others, the way we manage our resources, and even the way we view ourselves.
It's about shifting from a mindset of fear and scarcity to a mindset of love and abundance. And that shift can have ripple effects throughout our lives and the lives of those around us.
Absolutely. And one final thought on this theme of transformation that really struck me came from a pastor who talked about how experiencing God's love can actually change our perception of the world.
Okay, that's intriguing. How does God's love change our perception?
Well, the pastor explained that when we're living in fear, we tend to see the world as a dangerous and hostile place. We're constantly on guard, looking for threats and anticipating the worst.
It's like we're wearing these fear-tinted glasses that distort our view of reality.
Exactly. But when we experience God's love, it's like those glasses come off. We start to see the world through the lens of love, and everything looks different. We see beauty where we once saw ugliness. We see hope where we once saw despair. And we see possibilities where we once saw limitations.
It's like the world hasn't changed, but our way of seeing it has been completely transformed.
It's about recognizing that even in the midst of darkness and suffering, God's love is still present, still active, and still capable of bringing beauty and hope into the world.
It's a reminder to look for the good, to celebrate the small victories, and to hold on to hope even when things feel difficult.
And this perspective can be incredibly helpful for pastors and Bible study leaders, especially when you're ministering to people who are hurting or going through difficult times.
It's about offering them a new way of seeing the world, a way that's grounded in hope, love, and the unwavering presence of God.
Exactly. It's about reminding them that even in the darkest of times, they are not alone. God's love is with them, surrounding them, and guiding them towards healing and wholeness.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 1 John 4:18, I think the biggest takeaway is that this verse, while seemingly simple, is actually a treasure trove of wisdom and inspiration.
It's a reminder that God's love is not just a concept or an idea, but a powerful force that can transform our lives and the world around us.
And for pastors and Bible study leaders, hopefully this deep dive has provided you with some fresh insights, creative illustrations, and practical tools to share this timeless message of love with your congregations.
We've seen how perfect love casts out fear, how love is an action, how unaddressed guilt can hold us back, and how God's love has the power to transform us from the inside out.
It's been an incredible journey exploring these different facets of God's love, and we hope you found it as enriching and insightful as we have.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 1 John 4:18. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep allowing God's love to shape and transform your life.
And remember, the deepest dives often lead to the most amazing discoveries. We'll see you on our next adventure into the depths of God's Word.